Yo, what's up, comrades? Hope everyone's doing great. We're here to talk about an X-Men, New Mutants, Uncanny X-Men series of events that at least... So normally I base these titles, or kind of like the arcs, off the way the folders are set up in the Chronological X-Men version 2 packs, right? But some of these are just like untitled, and so I kind of got to look through them. So I'm kind of going with Selene right now, because we focus heavily on the Selene, at least in the first part, and then maybe we'll take a break if she wanders away, and then we'll move on to something else. I'll think about it. But we start with New Mutants number 22. New Mutants 22 focuses on the X-Men, well, a bit on the some of the X-Men training some of the New Mutants. So we start with Nightcrawler's training Cannonball to be a little bit better at his job, to be less afraid of heights and to have more control. And there's a thing where Rain comes in and like blows him a kiss to not to Bobby, to Sam, not to Nightcrawler. And then, you know, he does this thing, Nightcrawler saves him. They talk about how Sam's like, oh, I'm a loser, I'm a failure. And Nightcrawler's like, no, you're just learning, you gotta figure it out. And then he uses something in the danger room to transform the whole thing into like a circus. And then he like, him and Rain are dressed like clowns and they dance. And then he reveals he's not Sam because she thought she was dancing with Sam. And she freaks out because he's the devil. She's got a lot of issues with that. And so she runs off being all sadapotamus. And then Sam's about to run after her, but Nightcrawler's like, just let her be. She runs by Sunspot, Bobby, DaCosta, and Colossus, Peter Rasputin. As Peter's trying to train DaCosta in like being more defensive oriented, because he's very powerful attack wise, but his defense is not very good. So if he can get him to be better at like defending himself or dodging, whatever would be good. So they go back and forth, and then something happens to Colossus and he kind of freaks out, and then Bobby kind of freaks out a little bit. And then we get Rain, she runs and looks into a room where Moira has showed up, right? Because she's here to help figure out the whole Warlock situation with Professor X. So they're kind of messing around with him in a room and talking about that. And then she decides she's going to go to her room. A bit later, we just have like a shot of Amara and Bobby like swimming in the pool. And then we go to Rain, and someone at some point makes some comment about how Rain and Bobby are not doing well right now, that something's occurred with the demon bear and all that. Then now they're not doing great. Oh, it was Danny, because Rain runs up to Danny. Danny's talking to her parents are in her back. She's super happy about that. And then Rain runs off, and then she thinks about like, oh my gosh, this girl is killing me. At that juncture, we switch completely to like a totally different thing. Well, first we hit up Selene. Selene's going in. She goes to like the super fancy place and like demands to like get an apartment or whatever, and just to be rich and fancy and whatnot. And then we get like that leads directly into Bobby's dad integrating himself in the, oh my gosh, it slipped in my head, with Shaw and Emma Frost, the Hellfire Club. And so, you know, this Selene and all this is going to be tied together pretty soon. That's why I kind of focus on Selene for this. We then jump to Rain, this is where it goes completely off the rails. She's like writing a fairy tale about her, and she's got a handsome prince who's supposed to be Sam. And then she goes off to like fight demons or something who attacked the prince because they're evil. And one of them's obviously, I think one of them's supposed to be Nightcrawler, but one of them is obviously Magic, or Ileana Rasputin. And then, you know, after she finishes, she lays down and has nightmares. And then we get like a couple shots of introductions to like some of the New Mutant characters, in case you're joining us like 2 years in almost. We move forward over to X-Men number 189. What's going on here? Okay. So we pick up with Amara and Rachel Summers, the girl from the future with the red hair. They're hanging out on the Empire, not the Empire, what's this fucking thing called? The Statue of Liberty, looking out at New York, talking about how grand it is and whatnot. And then Rachel has a recollection of the future past, the past future, her past, but the future of like, not this world, but another world. It's so stupid. Anyway, she was made into like a hound to hunt down other mutants using her telepathic powers. So she's recalling that, and then she's having like a little cry, and Amara's like, you okay? And she's like, oh yeah, I'm just, you know, the wind or something. And she's like, okay. And then Amara's like, hey, is that ship over there the one Aurora's taking? And we see a cruise liner that's headed to Africa. I think Kenya, to be specifically, is where Aurora's from. But she's getting on there. She's going to head out. And she's saying goodbye. There's Ileana, Rogue, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Xavier, and Lockheed. And they're talking about Wolverine and Kitty still being in Japan. You know, Storm's, now that her powers aren't there, being an X-Men isn't like the main thing for her anymore. And so they're talking about how they're going to head out. She's going to head out and just reconnect with nature and all that good stuff and kind of figure herself out. And so everyone's crying and hugging it out and whatnot. We then jump back to Amara. And, well, first of all, we just jumped to them for a second. They're like wandering around town. We jumped to that guy. It's been a minute, but there was a guy who found this like necklace in like the fish crates, and then he's like freaking out, and he looks in that, and he's having some sort of like crazy thing where there's like a voice talking to him and talking about like a murderer in his heart will summon his spirit or whatever. Anyway, we then jump back over to Mara and Rachel. They're walking around looking at the Roman baths in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and such. And then Rachel gets like a premonition. And so her and Mara run out, and she has like sensed Selene. And so then they track Selene over to the Hellfire Club, and then they break in there and they get dressed up as maids. Meanwhile, Selene is introducing herself as the new Black Queen to Sebastian Shaw. And she demonstrates her powers to have control over inorganic material. And Shaw breaks out, and then Selene's like, it is my tradition to bring gifts to my patron or whatever when I'm joining a new thing. And so she does some sort of like hypnosis trick and like runs off. And then we get, what is this? Tessa, I think is her name. Tessa and Shaw are talking about Selene being the new Black Queen and all the shit she's doing and whatnot. Meanwhile, Rachel is laughing because of like this ridiculous thing she's doing. We're acting like a maid and whatnot. And then she senses Selene, and so she charges and attacks her. But what row? It was actually Amara. And then Selene grabs her from behind and uses her like hypnosis powers to trick Rachel and Amara into being like slaves for her, essentially. And so Rachel breaks free of that a little bit and dives into, she gets a super awesome like ninja costume. And so she dives into Amara's mind and gets her to realize that Selene's like trying to control her. And then she like rebels and uses like her fire powers and is like blasting, and they both like pop out of like the mind or whatever. And Amara's like losing her mind, blasting Selene, destroying like the whole building with her fire powers and whatnot. And then so Selene grabs them up, but then Nightcrawler shows up, grabs Selene, and teleports out of there. And the rest of the X-Men, Rogue, Colossus, and Xavier burst in there, calm Amara down. And then Xavier and Sebastian are like, they come to like, not a head, they like come to an agreement. So like, I didn't choose to just kidnap these people. I apologize for like my subordinates, and like, you can take them and go, but like, get out of here and we'll just call it good. And he's like, okay. So we see a bunch of maids and servants cleaning up this big mess, and the X-Men are talking about what's going on, and Rachel uses her powers to transform Amara and her out of the maid costumes, and they all kind of meander out of there. And at some point, Rachel's like, did you hear my psychic cry? And they like walk outside, and the whole street is like destroyed in front of the building, and Xavier is like, not exactly. We then end this issue with we see a poster of Dazzler. She's going to come up in this run, I'm pretty sure. And then the guy with the necklace is standing there listening to something on his Walkman when he kind of stabbed from behind by a guy. And then when the guy picks up the necklace because he's a murderer, he like summons Kulan Kath, and who's like burning up this entire subway. And so we'll get to that a bit later. New Mutants number 24 we start off still with Selene and the Hellfire Club and whatnot. So they're doing like some sort of like Masonic initiation where they're drinking out of a cup and swearing their allegiance and all this stuff. And then we flip over to Colossus, who's just playing chess with some old Russian in Salem Center, New York, which is right outside where the X-Mansion's at. It's like the little town attached to it, essentially, in like Westminster or Westchester or whatever the county it's over in. Anyway, so at some point, Bobby's there and he's like hanging out. He's got a thing for the frail. For the barmaid, but then he starts like kind of losing it, and Colossus tries to get him to calm down, and then they fight and then Bobby's got some sort of like shadow powers or something, and so something's like really amiss. So Colossus calls out to Professor X. Professor X summons Sam and Danny, and so we get some fan service of Danny getting dressed, and then they head off over there, and they find Colossus has like knocked the shit out of Sunspot, and then Sunspot's like tried to absorb him, and then he's like stumbled around and collapsed. So then Danny and Sam bring Peter Rasputin and Bobby DaCosta back, and then Moira and Professor X are looking at them, and they're talking about what was going on and how it's kind of weird and all this stuff. And then Danny gets like a call on the phone, and she freaks out, and so she runs upstairs, and Rain's gone. And then we get this like funny dream that she had about a redheaded beautiful woman in like a yellow dress at this hotel, and so she's like, we got to go there, that's where Rain's going to be. And she knows this, and we find this out about this later when Sam questions her, because I think Sam is officially the leader of the New Mutants, or like they split leadership between the two of them at this juncture. Yeah, I think they're splitting leadership still. And she tells him that she had a dream, and she had the dream because her and Rain are like psychically connected, right? So they head over to this hotel, and Danny uses her powers, which she's gained a lot better control. So instead of just like flashing people with like random scary thoughts from their brain, she can like target memories and stuff. So she's becoming much better at like her telepathic powers, telepathic. So they find Rain on the top floor, and she's freaking out and having like a complete breakdown because she like doesn't. She thought she went to bed in her bed, and now she's wearing like strange clothes in this strange place, and like she doesn't know how she got here or how any of this stuff works. So they take her back and they put her down to bed, and at some point, Danny's like, "What's this necklace over here?" And Rain's like, "I don't know. Please, you can get rid of it." And Danny, I guess, recognizes it. Because, well, I don't know if she recognizes it. They go downstairs and they're talking about it, and they're kind of arguing back and forth. And this is where Danny reveals to Sam that she's had this dream. And then she like gets mad and throws like a coffee mug at the wall. And then Sam's like trying to clean it up with a newspaper, but then he sees this story about Cloak and Dagger. What's her name? It's Tanya and Jerome? Tyrone. It's Tyrone. I'm pretty sure. Tyrone and I think it's Tanya. Something like that, who are the Cloak and Dagger, right? They're like the blonde white chick who uses light powers and the black guy uses shadow cape, right? Anyway, so they were like stabbed or attacked or something, and they were in the hospital. So Danny and Sam go to visit them, and they're talking about how, gosh, so like a year ago in X-Men times, like a long time ago, there was an incident where they worked with Cloak and Dagger, and Rain and Bobby were like captured, and they put drugs in them that transformed to like monstrous forms of themselves, and like they kind of absorbed the powers of Cloak and Dagger. But it seems like that like has finally settled because Cloak and Dagger, like Tyrone and Tanya, if that's their names, like don't have their powers anymore, and they're fine with that. And then they get to like a funny argument with the New Mutants about like how they got to like take their powers back, and they're like, no, we just want to be regular kids. We're like, absolutely do not want to do that. And so it's like, what are they going to do? And then, you know, well, Sam and Danny consider that. We hop back over to Professor X and Moira, and there's like nothing wrong with Bobby, and they can't figure anything out, and they're going to go take a break and kind of like think about it. And then Bobby like wakes up in his like berserker form, his berserker like half cloak, half sunspot form, and then like eats Peter Rasputin or something, and then attacks Moira and Professor X. Professor X tries to fight back, but it seems to have failed. Oh, also in this issue, we jump back to Magneto, who's with Forrester. What is her first name? Alice Forrester? I don't think that's it. Anyway, the Captain Forrester who used to bang Cyclops for a little bit, and then Magneto was kind of like flirting with her. So she saved him from the ship in like the previous issue or two, and now she's taking him back to like his Cthulhu, like what is it, Ralok kingdom that he pulled out of the water, and he's like all fucked up and like his head hurts and like all this stuff, right? Issue number 24 picks up right where we left off with kind of like a quick recap of what's going on. So Berserker Sunspot is attacking Professor X and knocks him out, and then he's about to attack Moira, and Raid walks in, transforms back into like that beautiful red-haired woman, and then she's like pure light, right? Because she's got Cloaks or Dagger's powers. And then she like calms Bobby down, they grab each other, Sam and Danny show up, and then they like teleport the fuck out of there. And so Professor is like, mind link with me so I can understand what's going on. And then we finally get the kind of like the recap of like Cloak and Dagger, their situation, the situation where they got drugged up, like Rain and Bobby got drugged up and everything that occurred right there. And they're like, huh. We then jump over to Tanya. No, it's not Tanya. It's Tandy. Tandy and Tyrone, who have left the hospital, and they're trying to like get out of there. Tyrone's got a lot of qualms with the fact that Tandy's like a rich white girl, and that they can't really be together and whatnot. And he's like very concerned. We then jump over to Magneto, who's still with Forrester, Allison Forrester, something. Anyway, It's Lee Forrester. That's right. It just popped into my head. Lee Forrester. She's wearing like a beautiful dress, and he comes up and he apologizes for being an asshole before, and then he walks off, and then she's got like a shit-eating grin, and she's like, "Ooh, looks like someone can apologize." Meanwhile, Rain and Bobby have teleported to Father Michael, I think. He's the one who's kind of adopted and taken care of what's her name? Nguyens? I think it's Win. I think that's how you're supposed to pronounce it. It's Vietnamese, right? Her sister and brother. And so he's hanging out, and then Bobby like collapses, and the priest is going to try to help him out. We jump back over to Cloak and Dagger. They're having more conversations. Some drug dealer tries to sell him drugs, and Tyrone's like, get the fuck out of here. Back over at the church, Rain and Bobby have like a funny conversation, and then Rain turns into like a wolf because she's got to go inside Bobby to like save Peter, and she goes in there and we get a funny scene with Peter. He like is in a desert and he's miserable, and then Kitty shows up and is like, my love, and then Colossus sees Zaj from Secret Wars. Yeah, that's what it was called. And then he like turns to her instead, and the whole world like dissolves. And then he's like freaking out, and he's in darkness. And then Rain saves him and pulls him out. And right then, Professor X has shown up with Rogue and Danny and Sam, and Ileana's along for the ride. And then Rain like transforms back into normal Rain and hugs him out. We then go back to Tyrone and Tandy, and they're having more conversations. And Tandy's like really upset at him for not making the right choice and just taking the powers back, right? And being selfish and whatnot. Back over at the church, we get like a funny comment about Sam and like his girlfriend, Leela, which we'll get to that more later with Dazzler. I think it's with Dazzler. Maybe it's just in regular X-Men, but she's like a famous singer who is like from space. And we haven't read about her at all. And so I'm kind of surprised I had this shirt because I could have sworn, I don't know. We'll get to it, but she's like around. And she's pretty funny. So let's see. Rain and Bobby are like sleepopotamus. Ileana's there in the church and she's freaking out because she's in a church and she's like a demon. And then they're all having a conversation about what to do, about linking, about making the connection and everything that's going on with that. And so Professor X can't do it and Danny offers. And he's like, all right, let's link up and make it happen. So they start doing it. And then there's like the shadow tries to possess Danny, and Ileana like pulls out her soul sword and like cuts it out of her. And then she's like, I got to use magic to save these guys. So she grabs Bobby and Rain and teleports to Limbo and tries to do a spell to like remove the shadow and the light powers, but instead she absorbs them. And it's like a big problem. So she finally is able to cast them out of herself, but they just go right back to Bobby and Rain. And then she teleports everybody back over. Professor X is like, Ileana, what the fuck? Blah, 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 blah. And she's like, I'm sorry. And he's like, sorry's not good enough. And then he goes on this rant about like, I'm not going to sacrifice one of my students for like the other students or whatever. And then at that exact moment, Tyrone and Tandy roll up and they're like, well, if you're going to sacrifice anyone, it should be us. So we're going to wrap up this arc, which started off, I was calling it the Selene arc, but it's actually more about Cloak and Dagger and their abilities, especially these last 3, but even more so issues. It's kind of dealing with it with some Selene stuff at the beginning, which kind of relates to stuff going on later. So we're not gonna go with that. Maybe we'll just go to Selene and Cloak and Dagger arc. Okay, so this final issue in this arc that we're gonna cover in this video is New Mutants number 25. So we pick up exactly where we left off, right? They're just back to back. Tandy's talking to her uncle, who's Bishop Mike and whatnot, and we get like some recap of everyone that's here and why they're here. And this is all like Professor X is setting up stuff and being super smart, right, with having Ileana here and Rogue. And I even looked ahead because I was like, when does Leela come up? And I was like, oh, that's right. She's in the New Mutants annual, which we're going to cover in like 6 weeks when I cover the X-Men and the New Mutants annual from this year. And that's when Leela comes up and starts dating Sam or something. Anyway, so we get a lot of Tyrone and Tandy going back and forth, and Tyrone just being super upset. Most of this issue is just Tyrone being upset and being a little sadapotamus about the cloak abilities and about losing control and feeling like he's a drug addict and just being like real sad about everything. So everyone kind of like chit chats and talks to him. Ileana gets chewed out, and we get like a preview or a review of like what happened last episode. And then Professor X does like some mind stuff and really gets into it with Tyrone, and Ileana like observes and whatnot. So they're just like talk about all his feelings about Professor X, about how his powers manifested and it caused problems with like his half brother Kane and all with Juggernaut and all that stuff. And they talk. And then at some point, Tyrone starts like kind of getting over being such a puss. And Tandy runs up and gives him a hug and they like kiss it out and whatnot. And they decide that they're going to take the powers back. So then Professor X does this whole thing where they like teleport out of there. And then they're going to wherever they're at. I think they're in Limbo, actually. And then Sam and Danny are going to get ready to fight whatever shows up. And then Rogue and Professor X, well, Rogue's going to like absorb the light powers with the help of Professor X from Rain. And then she's going to absorb the shadow powers. And then she's going to like give them back to Cloak and Dagger. And Magic has to be there to like fight the shadow because it's super hungry. It's like a hungry potamus and hold them in place so that, and then Tyrone leaps at the cloak as well, the dark powers. And then finally Rogue's able to absorb all of that. And then, Sam pulls Rain and Bobby away, and then Professor X and Rogue team up to kind of insert the powers back into Cloak and Dagger. And everything goes well. And then we get like a nice little scene where Cloak looks all cloaky and Dagger looks hot as fuck. And they're like chatting about how everything's good and how they got to go fight. And Professor X invites them once again to join the X-Men. But they're like, no, we have to go save the people on the streets and whatnot and all that good stuff. And then they nope out of there. And then we get a cute little up. Well, then Ileana's like, oh, it's not that impressive what they do. We do stuff like that all the time. And then she falls asleep because she's a tired little bear. And we get the epilogue where we see a douchebag from like the previous issue, and he's trying to give drugs to kids again when Cloak and Dagger show up and beat the shit out of him and then scare him like half out of his mind. And then they talk about how like this is their job to like save children and to help rid the streets of the darkness and help the runaways and whatnot. And it's like dun dun dun, wraps it up. And so that's the end of this arc. Go ahead and like, share, subscribe, comment, and I think we're doing Dazzler the movie next week. Hell yeah. Or in 2 weeks. And then we're going to get into some like really wackadoo stuff with the X-Men, and then we'll do the annual. So it's going to be a bit out. We'll find out more about Leela. And the next time we pick up with the New Mutants, so Leela, the story of Leela actually takes place kind of like in the middle of this arc or like before this arc. So I really should have covered it before then, but I'm not going to do that. It's going to be much later, but we'll get to that. And then we'll hit Legion up is going to be the next major arc in that for the New Mutants. So go ahead, like, share, subscribe, comment, and I will catch you guys later. Bye.